So I think even like knowing when to turn it on and when to relax is half of the art right there.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, of course.
Yeah.
Same as in life, right? If you only have the mentality, go, push harder, you're gonna burn yourself out, you know. It's cool to get stuff done, it's better than being lazy. But at the same time, even that's gonna mess you up. You know, Taoism is big on that concept. Like anything taken to an extreme that's past a healthy point, stop being a good thing, even good things.
Hello and welcome to the Vinny Brosco Show podcast, episode number 443. Hope you're enjoying the show so far. If you are, do me a favor, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening to this podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or if you want the video version, or if you're watching the video version, head on over to YouTube, subscribe, leave a comment, click the like button, and of course, spread the word and tell a friend. This week's episode number 443, I'm joined by Daniele Bolelli. Daniele is a father, he's an author, a professor, he is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and Judo, and an 8th degree black belt in Kung Fu Sansu. He is also the host of the Drunken Taoist podcast and the host of one of my favorite podcasts, History on Fire, where Daniele dives into historical events and historical figures that have helped shape the world, such as Bruce Lee, Marcus Aurelius, Joan of Arc, Jack Johnson, and my personal favorite, Theodore Roosevelt. Daniele does a deep dive into these events and to these figures and brings them all into the modern world and gives a modern interpretation of what was transpiring and makes a beautiful connection from history to today. And these aren't short little episodes. These are 3-hour, 3-part sagas. You need a notebook and a lot of attention, but it's like going into an amazing college classroom and listening to your favorite professor wax on about some of the most historical, pivotal events and people in history. Daniele and I dove into a bunch of different topics, everything from the importance of martial arts to the common thread that weaves its way through historical figures. It was an absolute pleasure speaking to Daniele, and I hope you enjoy the episode number 443 with Daniele Bolelli. Enjoy.
Hey, this is Daniele Bolelli, and this is the Vinny Brasco Show.
And here we go.
How are you?
Good.
Thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm a big fan of your work across the board, from podcasting to just your writing to the things that you've done. To say the least, you're a polymath, to say the least, right? Mind, body, spirit, professor, black belt, philosopher. What came first for you? Was it the mind, the body, or the spirit element of things?
Hard to tell. I think like the way I grew up, no, I probably grew up more of a nerd than not. I grew up, you know, my dad was a writer, my mom was a writer, so there was that kind of environment all around me growing up, where writing, talking about books, talking about, you know, I would read books when I was like 7 years old. And I don't mean books like children book, I would mean like, I remember starting reading Zen Buddhism when I was 10. Like I was doing weird shit because just like that's how I grew up. That's what was around me, right? So it wasn't like a strange thing to me. That was like, well, that's what they talk about at the dinner table. So why should I be out of it, kind of thing. But I also, of course, I like sports like most young kids. And as a kid, I played a ton of basketball. I really enjoyed, that was my thing. It was funny too. I remember meeting a former friend. I mean, not former friend, like he was still a friend, but like former teammate from basketball who asked me many years later, "Are you still playing basketball?" And I was like, "No, mainly do martial arts." And he was like, "The way you played, not a whole lot of difference there."
So you kind of always had the physical element of things, and then obviously being in that type of household and that type of environment, you weren't reading, you know, run, spot, run. That wasn't the
Right.
type of literature you were reading. As a child, was that something that you found you were more receptive to because you didn't have all of these influences from culture and like you were just this, you know, fresh palette to kind of be expressed on?
I think people sometimes don't give enough credit to kids. They think that kids are dumb. And don't get me wrong, plenty of people of all ages are dumb. But at the same time, the point is just because somebody's a kid doesn't mean that they can't understand stuff. Of course, they have less experience. Of course, they are going to have a smaller vocabulary. But other than that, if you really talk with kids about stuff that's meaningful, about stuff that's, I think you'll be surprised to realize how much you can relate, how much you can have really deep conversations and at the same time play and screw around. You don't have to be all serious all the time. But I think a lot of kids, if you stimulate that muscle in them, that kind of mind muscle, that he will grow, he will be. And of course there's a nature nurture kind of thing, how much of it is the environment and how you raise them, and how much is just how they are and they have a certain predisposition. Clearly the answer is both, but it's kind of hard to tell in which measure. Is it can you do that with all kids, or can you only do it with some kids who are more inclined toward it? That I don't know, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it boils down to the parents and the influence, and like you said, like what you're surrounding them by. Like my daughter's 6, my son is 2, and her new thing is my daughter, when she gets upset, she does
right.
And now she does it with her brother when he's getting upset. So, you create and you try to instill these habits and these good practices for them. And it's to your point that I think that many parents dismiss their children. Right? It's like, we're not having this conversation at the dinner table, or, they think they're going to outkick their coverage. But when you really sit down with the child, they can go pretty far into depth, into thought. And she's now taking religion classes, and she starts coming home with these questions. And, as her father, and as someone who maybe doesn't identify so much as Catholic anymore, you try to walk on that razor's edge a little bit, where you're like, okay, how do I explain this with being authentic to what I believe, and also teaching the essence of the religion without having it to be this pragmatic, dogmatic, this is Jesus, this is God,
Right. I mean, I think those are very honest conversation, and I would approach them in the, hey, this is what some people believe.
Right.
This is what I believe, and here is why. I don't know if that's true, because ultimately nobody knows, but here are my reasons for coming to these conclusions. Here are their reasons for coming to their conclusion. You figure it out. What do you think? What's your instinct? That's it. And just play it that way, very honest,
Yeah, and Stan, I like that piece of, what do you think? What does your instinct tell you? Because ultimately it boils down to a feeling, and it doesn't really matter what stamp of approval religiously you put on it, whether it be, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, whatever, whatever it is, it's the feeling that it invokes out of you that ultimately is the most important thing.
And that's the thing too, that you were hinting at it a second ago, and I hammer a lot on that, is at the end of the day, what counts is, does it help you become a better person or not? Does it make you a nicer person? Does it make you not snap when you're nervous? Does it, all these things? If it does, then it's a good thing. And if it doesn't, well, then we got a problem, no matter how cool the theory sound. And that's not something that a kid is not going to understand. You know what I mean? Kids very much can understand this extremely practical, pragmatic aspect of the conversation. And so I don't really see, like, I never had a discussion with my daughter that I couldn't have with adults, or vice versa. Like, to me, I always started having discussions with her because she would ask complicated questions. And so I would acknowledge that. I would go with it. I would be like, yeah, I mean, you are a human with tons of feelings, with tons of emotions, trying to figure out how to navigate in this world. Why should I dismiss your concern? Like, oh, don't think about it. Here is a toy. Go around, play with it. He's like, no, man, it's like, if you have those questions, I will talk to you. We will address it in that fashion. And, to me, I find it weird that people don't do that. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't find it strange to do that. I find it strange not to do that. Like, not so long ago, there was a friend of mine was visiting, and I had to do something. So he was talking with my daughter for a bit. And he was like, man, I forgot I was talking to I think she was 11 back then. To an 11-year-old. She feel like she's like the smartest 40-year-old I know, but then I turn around and she's got Barbies in the corner, and I'm like, oh, she's a kid. Wait, what's going on? And I'm like, yeah, how else should it be? I don't really see why it should be any other way.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And the more you nurture that, and the more you kind of add fuel to that, the more self-sufficient they become, the more instinctual they become, and they start to rely on those things. And that's how you build a stronger human being. And ultimately, hopefully that emanates and starts to spill out into other people around them. Your podcast, the Drunken Taoist podcast, what about Taoism kind of why the approach to Taoism specifically? Like, what about it kind of spoke to you out of everything else, all the other philosophies or religion? Because it's kind of in this weird space where it's a religion, but it's a philosophy and it's a, you know, mindset, and overall it's a feeling at the end of the day.
You're right, it's many things. Like religious Taoism and philosophical Taoism, to me, have only mildly to do with one another. You know, a lot of religious Taoism is animistic practices that are widespread throughout China that just happen to put a Taoist act on and, you know, add a couple of Taoist concepts. But it's really no different from any other animistic practice in China where they attach an extra layer on top. So to me, that's not my focus. That's more cultural specific. You know what I mean?
Sure,
This is the
yeah.
kind of stuff that if you grow up with it, maybe it makes more sense. But I tend to be more fascinated in Taoism as a philosophy, as a way of life, less as a ritual practice. And in terms of a philosophy, what I dig about Taoism compared to many other things is that, you know, in order to believe or espouse or practice a certain philosophy, you need to have read it and know it and apply those ideas. Taoism is so universal, it's in insights. You know, the kind of ideas that come up in Taoism are things that pretty much anybody who has been alive will run into. Whether they read Taoism or not is secondary. So to me, Taoism really speaks the language of life. Like you don't, paradoxically, you don't have to be a Taoist to be a Taoist. You know
Right.
what I mean? It's kind of like you can suddenly read Taoism after never having heard about it your whole life, and you go like, "Oh, damn, yeah, that's of course. I've seen that a million times
Right.
in my own experience." You know. So to me, that's more. It's not a belief system. It's more a description of how the universe works, of how
Mm.
life is. And as such, you don't need to find it in a book. Maybe you never read Taoism, but you apply Taoist ideas anyway, which is a bit different from what you normally do with philosophy or religions, where really you're not going to pop up with those ideas just randomly because, other than a few. So that's what I find interesting. And also, it doesn't really require you to have an identity or a membership. I need to be a Taoist. It's like, no, you don't. Take the ideas that make sense and use them. It's no different than, in some way, some scientific laws about the universe works. It's just kind of describing the way things are. And then if you want to use those insights that can help to make your life better, good for you. You don't, good for you. Who cares? Nobody's trying to convince you.
Yeah, there isn't a set rule or a set, like you said, obligation with it, right? It seems to be, and that's a perfect way to put it, an explanation of the universe, almost like like almost like quantum physics to some degree, where it's like this explanation of the unknown that kind of reverse engineers back to a feeling. You know, the biggest, I think, one of the biggest concepts of Taoism is Wu Wei, which is, you know, the doing by not doing, right?
Sure.
And you know, touch upon Bruce Lee, like being water, right? Going with the ebbs and the flows of the universe and allowing that to guide you, so to speak, and allowing to lean into that space rather than being so rigid and reluctant to go with what the universe is presenting to you.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that's like right there, for example. How's that? It's not a Taoist concept per se, right? It is,
Sure.
but it isn't. It's like, who wants to waste a bunch of energy to accomplish little, right? That's kind of what way is the idea of like maximum result with minimum effort. You know, how can you exert the least amount of force to get a job done? How can you use preventive approaches to solve a problem when it's in its initial stages rather than letting it blow up, and when it's crisis mode try to tackle it? You know, these are things that are, anybody can appreciate the obvious practical aspect of these things, and I think that's one of the things that's very appealing about Taoism.
Another aspect of it that I find to be like probably one of the most appealing, it's so general, but yet it's also so specific, right?
Right.
Because it's so general, because it's on such a grand level of thought, it's actually so deep.
Uh-huh. Absolutely. It doesn't get lost into too many weird metaphysical things. In some way, it kind of sticks to, you bring it back to, there's a very practical component to Taoism. At the end of the day, do it's about learning things that help you make your life easier. It's like, can you swim against the current? Yes. But if you learn how to swim with the current, it's a lot easier. And it's kind of like those kind of insights, where it's like you can immediately apply them. It's a philosophical idea, but you can apply them to day-to-day life, to communication, to pretty much anything you can think of. Those principles apply.
I think where it kind of seeps into for me, and I know you're a huge, obviously, an eighth degree black belt in Kung Fu and Judo and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and wrestling. I mean, you've touched the gamut of martial arts. And there's something about martial arts that also embodies that kind of mindset and that kind of, effortless action, right? Like, especially, the reason I kicked back this conversation a half hour is because I was trying to squeeze in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class. And
Right.
thank you for doing that, because I was able to. But there is this, especially when you're like a white belt, and I'm only a blue belt, but that white belt mentality, you're a cat in a bag. It's just muscle and energy and strength. And then all of a sudden you learn to kind of settle back into things. And obviously you see professors and you see, black belts, and you being one as well, you start to realize the game unfolds before you. And then you're able to have effortless action.
That's a perfect example, because it's so counterintuitive in some ways. And not only at the initial stages, like sometimes if you have somebody who's has good technique, but is also using a lot of muscle and strength and everything, you feel almost bound to match their intensity. And in some cases you kind of have to, but the key is have to the minimum degree where you can get the job done, and not overblow your grip, where suddenly you can grip no more because you grip too tightly for so long, and it was working, but until it doesn't, because you overdid. Or, things like that, where it's like, it's not that, like people, sometimes in some martial arts, people have taken these ideas too far, and they are very like, I'm just gonna noodle-like move out of the way and maneuver you. And it's like, yeah, that's not how it works. It's good luck trying to apply to somebody who's really determined, committed, and aggressive. At the same time, the mentality, I just need to go 150% pure strength, is going to carry you only so far, and is definitely going to diminish with age dramatically. So the key there is figuring out, how can I, as much as humanly possible, work technique and relaxation in a way where maybe I don't match the physicality of the other person evenly, but I can still outmaneuver them and maybe even outlast them because they gas themselves out,
And then there's also the chess element of it, where, and I see it with my professors, where they're 10 steps, 20 steps ahead,
Sure.
and their setup is just a setup. And I find solace in the fact that I'm aware of one setup. I'm like, oh, okay, I see that was a trap to put me in this position. And that there's also, and it's kind of to your point earlier, where you're kind of addressing what's directly in front of you now to prevent what's happening in the future, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're kind of hedging your bet almost by being prepared, and by also allowing the strength and the energy to flow a certain way.
Yeah, big time. Because that's the reality, right? Sometimes you do explode out of a position, because once that position is set, it's going to be so much harder to get out, right? Whereas if you try to counter it, even with strength, but at the right moment, you may not have to use that much strength later, because now you counter when he was still in a scramble. You use that extra burst of speed and energy when he was a scramble, not when you are like this dead weight on top of you that's now getting out is going to be harder,
Yeah.
So I think even like knowing when to turn it on and when to relax is half of the art right there.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, of course.
Yeah.
Same as in life, right? If you only have the mentality, go, push harder, you're going to burn yourself out, It's cool to get stuff done. It's better than being lazy. But at the same time, even that's going to mess you up. Taoism is big on that concept. Like, anything taken to an extreme that's past a healthy point, stop being a good thing. Even good things, drink 15 gallons of water in a row, you burst. Not that water is bad, but it's the quantity has been bad, right? It's like, so even in that, like, push yourself. That's great up to a point. Then you also need to know how to relax. And so it's kind of the yin yang concept, right? It's a dance between these two opposites, and you need to find a happy balance. And the happy balance is constantly changing. Some moments you have to push hard. Some moments you have to relax. Some moment is somewhere in between. And knowing how to navigate that scale, knowing how to flow from those 2 points is essentially what Taoism is.
I think also recognizing that in itself, right? I think just recognizing that there is an ebb and flow to the universe, to the cosmos, whatever you want to call it. There is an ebb and flow, and flowing and ebbing in between those spaces can be very, shattering, or it could be exhausting, or it could be whatever adjective you want to use there. But once you recognize you're in that space, then you're able to kind of manipulate that to your advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the key ultimately is, the philosophical principle, that's great and all, but at the end of the day is how you apply it. And how you apply it is a constant process, because maybe you did a great job 5 minutes ago, but now you lost touch. And now you're not doing it.
Right.
So it's an ongoing process where you are constantly course adjusting, and sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't.
What was the calling to martial arts for you specifically? Was there one thing that kind of put you on that trajectory, or was it just an overall kind of feeling that you went for?
I think is what most people who get into martial arts, you kind of have this idea of empowerment through martial arts. You sort of admire the discipline / results that you can achieve through the kind of dedication and discipline. And so I think there's ultimately the language that attracts most people when it comes to martial art is this idea of empowerment. This idea, and for me particularly, because I was so nerdy and intellectually driven, having a practice where none of that matters, where it's about kind of what the results that you can achieve on the mat, regardless of what flowery justification you can put around it, of what a good speech, that was appealing to me, because it was like, so much of our mental processes are subjective. Take the greatest piece of music ever. You're going to be on YouTube and there's going to be a bunch of people going, that sucks. That guy doesn't know how to play.
Right.
Take anything you want can be spun in another way, in an intellectual fashion, because there's a strong subjective element. Certain physical things are not subjective. There's a very clear-cut objectivity to it all. You either get tapped or you tap the guy. You either win or you lose. There's not a whole lot of room for ambiguity there. And I found that very mentally relaxing. Like, okay, there is something out there where the results speak for themselves, and I like that aspect.
One thing I love about jiu-jitsu so much is that it seems to be that there's 2 camps in jiu-jitsu. One is I think everyone gets a good workout from it no matter what. Sure. So that's the underlying, net positive. But I think that there's 2 camps. There's the, training for competition camps. And then there's this kind of mindful, philosophical, chess match that also transpires. That's kind of where I lean towards a bit more, is more of the philosophical and more of the metaphysical that's transpiring in a jiu-jitsu role.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's to some degree they could and should go together, because jiu-jitsu, of course, is based on competition. Sure. But at the same time, if all you're focused on is competing and winning, is like, clap, 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 here is your $3 medal. Who cares? It's like, if you are a beast on the mat, but you're a complete asshole outside of the mat, you haven't really done that much for yourself to help you or the people around you or your own life. It's like, great, you are a monster on the mat. And sadly, you see that a lot. There are a ton of competitors who are super gifted, who are fantastic jiu-jitsu players, and they are just awful human beings. They are just really awful human beings. So this whole idea that like, oh, jiu-jitsu is going to make you a better person is like, not necessarily. It can help you. It can give you something to become more of what you are. But maybe if what you are is an asshole to begin with and you don't add anything else, you just become more of an asshole. It's like there's no. So I think sometimes the emphasis on purely and only practical results kind of loses sight of the fact that ultimately life is bigger than jiu-jitsu or any one thing. It's like, if it doesn't help you become a better human being in day-to-day life, who cares? You can do the perfect armbar. Good job. Whatever.
Right. I know, obviously your other podcast, History on Fire, you did a series on Bruce Lee, which you had mentioned in the episode. You had watched Bruce Lee at a very young age and watched him kind of transform culture, martial arts, philosophy. I mean, another true polymath, encompassing, a way of life that was very different at that time, but kind of part of a subculture almost.
Right. Absolutely.
How did that kind of play into your growth and development, both in martial arts and then also into the philosophical world?
Well, one thing that was cool, I mean, beside the obvious that everybody liked Bruce Lee because of just his presence, there was an intensity that came through the screen. I mean, if you watch most of the movies, they're fairly terrible movies, but the way he manages to carry the show, despite the fact that the movies are fairly terrible, is amazing. You can clearly sense that the guy had an insane charisma, a ridiculously powerful personality. So that's like the immediate hook. But then when you start looking at Bruce Lee's life, the guy was brilliant. He had very phenomenal ideas. Now, many of the ideas were not that original if you dig deep. A lot of them are straight up Taoism. A lot of them are, are derivative. He clearly got them from somewhere. But the way he applied them to the context of movie making, to the context of martial arts, to the context of a bunch of this, was brilliant and innovative. He took some older principles and applied them to the culture of the 1960s and 1970s in a really fantastic way. And that's one of the things that fascinate me the most about Bruce Lee, are sort of the philosophical insights.
Yeah. Your other episodes, I mean, you have so many of them, and they're one after the other, they're just captivating, because the people that you speak about, whether it be Jack Johnson, obviously, Teddy Roosevelt is one of my favorites of yours. I was actually looking to visit a book. I was like, I just want to read something about Teddy Roosevelt. And I was like, let me go back to that podcast. So I listened to it for a second time, and his upbringing and his story, part and parcel with so many people, and his relationship with martial arts and the way he kind of came through things. Is there something about the people you've spoke about, or people in history, that there's this similarity or this underlining factor or this thread that kind of weaves its way throughout?
Most of the people I'm fascinated with tend to be mildly mentally deranged. There's definitely an intensity and that makes them not normal. Now, not normal can be a good thing, can be a bad thing, or often is both. There is, I think, like people who have a different degree of sensitivity. Maybe it's not better or worse. Maybe it's just more. Right? You feel things more. Things are more intense for you than somebody. Their highs and minuses are +1, -1. Yours are +10, -10. Are you better? No, you're not better. You're more. Both in good and bad. So if you don't find if that's your sensitivity, and you don't find a way to harness it and let it help you, well, then you're screwed. Because now your lows are so low, the dark side gets so ugly that it can be really bad. If you do find a way to harness it on the other end, now you have a tremendous gift, because you can play at a level where there's so much more to you as a human being, and you can play at a level where you can keep a balance. You know how to not fall too deep into this ugly side, but you can get these great benefits that come from having intensity, from being extra passionate, from all of that. And I think a lot of these people, to me, that I tend to cover are human beings that fit that mold, who are not normal human beings in the most wide sense of the word. They are people who are clearly born different. They have something in them that's pushing them. And in one way or another, they find a way to make it work. Not always perfectly, but like they find something that works for them to channel this overabundant spirit that they have.
Who's someone that has harnessed it for good, and who's someone that who hasn't had the ability to harness it for good?
So, for example, if you look like somebody, I did a couple of episodes on this guy because he's one of my all-time favorite. EQ was a Zen monk from the late 1300s, early 1400s. He's a blast. He's super fun. He's hilarious. His main passion are Zen, women, and drinking. And he just has a great life. He has a good impact on lots of people around him, tremendous impact on the culture of Japan. But more importantly, he enjoys life. He's not a dick about it. Perfect. That's as good as it gets. if you look at like a lot of historical characters that have made a history are the other side, right? They clearly have intensity. You know, if you look at Alexander the Great, the guy clearly had passion, he had intensity, but he was a raging alcoholic, killing his friends with a spear over a minor drunken insult or something, you know? The dude clearly had issues. He goes out and conquer half of the world, you know what I mean? But it's like that shows the intensity to some degree, but it
Sure.
doesn't show your ability to handle it in a way that's even remotely healthy.
Is there someone specifically that if you could sit down with and have a conversation, is there someone that you would, out of everybody that you've done episodes on, is there someone that stands out? You'd say, I'd love to sit with this person more than anybody else.
Probably EQ, because it's fun. You sit around, you drink, you laugh. It's perfect.
It's perfect. Throughout, you also obviously cover history in events, right? Not just people, but
Sure.
events themselves. What is the worst time, in your opinion, of human history? And are we in it now?
There are a lot, right? I think it's depends on a lot of factor of what you want to consider. I mean, obviously, if you're in the middle of the Black Death, it's probably bad, right?
Yeah.
Like 30% of the people around you are dying is probably bad. Actually, even worse if you want to look at it. Like if you are Native American after Europeans show up and like
Sure.
50 to 90% of your population got wiped out, I think that's even worse. So it's like there are a lot of situations where, yeah, it's almost hard to pick because there are so many crappy periods in history. And of course, periods is a vague term because it depends on who you are, where
Sure.
you are. It varies. You know, if you're in the middle of the Black Death, but you're this ruler who can sort of sit away from everybody, you're extracting tributes and resources, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe you can manage to quarantine and keep it at bay and you still have a blast with the maximum luxury that term can. You know, so I think it's relative to who you are in society, where you are, which particular event has taken place, because the same exact year can be fantastic for people in one place and terrible for people in another.
Yeah.
Can be fantastic for people in the same place but in one position in society versus another. So I think it varies a lot.
It's kind of what we're going through now, or we're going through, and kind of on the wherever we are in this whole scheme of things, where it just your relationship with what's transpiring at the time, right, and where you are in the mix of it, right, where you are, whether it be financially or socially, or yeah, it's a good point that it doesn't necessarily have to. It could be terrible for one and fantastic for the other.
I mean, look at it like today, for example. We are, if you live in US today, you are in one of the most affluent societies ever in human history. Yay, that's a win. Infant mortality is pretty low. Yay, that's a win. On the other hand, depression is off the roof. Okay, that's not a win. So is it good? Is it bad? It's like it's both, right? Depending on what metric you decide to use, you have both. People are lonelier than they probably ever been. There's a level of depression that's insane. And at the same time, we are more affluent and your kids don't die in childhood. Ideally, you would like to have both, right? If you want to have good mental health and have your kids not die in childhood. You know what I mean? It's like so it's a tricky one in that sense because, or, you know, even like the way where we are today, where we have so many fantastic tools at our disposal. And at the same time, it's pretty clear that we're not heading in a good direction in terms of our ability to sustainably continue this course of this path. You know, currently to be generous is a big open question if we can continue as a society as we are on a clearly unsustainable path, since we've been burning through natural resources accumulating over centuries and centuries in extremely fast time. I mean, even then, like the fact that something like environmental issues have to be a political issues with sides about it is completely insane. It's like, how is that a political issue? Nobody likes to have poison in their water or in the air they breathe. You know what I mean? It should be something that every single person, regardless of religion or politics, agree on. It's like, okay, we can go back to hating each other on the other things, but can we all agree that maybe keeping the planet that allow us to live in a healthy way is not a bad idea? No, even that's too much to ask. And you're like, Jesus Christ, that's a little weird.
Right.
So that does make you wonder, one end you're sitting with so much, you go to your fridge and there's food in there. Yay, there are no zombies at your door trying to eat you. Yay, that's all good stuff. But at the same time, we are doing things that both on an individual level, in terms of mental health, in terms of environmental issues and future, are terrible. And so
Right.
it's like, is it good? Is it bad? It's like, it's both.
Yes, absolutely. Is there anything that we could learn from the past? Because again, I agree with you that we're not on a sustainable trajectory right now. Is there anything that we could take from the past that we could apply to the present to prevent what seems to be the inevitable future?
I think is the challenge, and it's of course is a lot easier said than done, but the challenge is to figure out there are a couple of things that need to be addressed. One is the environmental one, of course. There's nothing else matters unless you figure out a way
Right.
to
Right.
keep life sustainable.
Yeah. If we don't have a planet to live on, it really means nothing.
Yeah. So any other discussion is after you go through the first 10 priorities that are all environmental, we can start talking about number 8. Once you get to that, I think that figuring out, like, one of the major diseases of the human being struggle with is loneliness and depression. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're not wired for this lifestyle. Working that many hours a day in some cubicle, away from your family, away from your friends, probably not living in your own house, away from everybody. It's not exactly the way we are designed. We've been designed to live in small hunting and gathering tribes. I think we need that kind of social life. We need human contact. So figuring out, how do you go back to bringing back, in some sense, villages, while at the same time not retreating to the old style village that was closed in, very squashing anybody who doesn't fit into the norm of the 50 people around you, and squashing of individuality. How can you combine, in a way, some measure of tribal living with some measure of individualism and living in the modern world and thinking on a global scale? I think that's super important. Finding, having roots in a local community, in a face-to-face community, people that you can interact with, while at the same time having your individuality being respected and being able to pack up and go somewhere else in global terms. That's a big one. Related to environmental, but not only, is a relationship with food and things like that. Being able to grow some of your own food, being able to have a place that maybe you have 15 houses and you have a central space in the middle where you and your friends, you all have your house, you have your privacy. If you don't want to see anybody, you close the door. But at the same time, you have this communal space where you can go do Jiu Jitsu together, or you have your gardens where if you want to go on vacation, your friends take care of it and the food is still going to grow. Having some of that, I think there are ways to improve our health on a personal level, improve our health on a global level, improve our mental health through greater human connections. Theoretically, we have all the instruments technologically to live in a paradise. We are very far from that. So tackling this theme, and I'm not saying there's an easy answer. There isn't. I'm not going to be like, oh, here is the 7 easy steps to a fantastic society. It's not that easy, But I think the themes are there. I think that it's important to at least identify what the themes are and figure out how to address them, what could be, in order to set up an experiment, you at least need to have an hypothesis, right? And so at least starting with the hypothesis of, I think we need to address this area and figure out, and now let's tweak it and see what works and what doesn't.
Do you think we evolve past needing to have that interpersonal human connection? I know right now we're it's part of our DNA essentially, right? And I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. But do we get to a point where we're so far disconnected that we no longer need that humanistic experience?
I mean, it's weird. You ask me now, and I'm in the most antisocial period of my life. I'm just like, the phone rings and my first instinct is, who the fuck are you and what do you want from me? And I don't think that's the healthiest possible state of mind, because I'm just very, leave me the hell alone and don't talk to me. I'm not thinking that's a sign of phenomenal mental health. I think it's necessary sometime. I think I've interacted with way too many people for way too long. I think I've given of my energy a lot in many different directions. And sometimes you just need to recharge and be able to. But I don't think that. Can you make it work being more of a hermit? Yes, of course. Can you even have a decent life that way? Yes, of course. Do I think that that's the way most human beings are designed? No, I don't think so. I think in some way, even like my antisocial thing, to some degree, is a reaction to not having that kind of like, if I had all these great relations that are feeding me, that are nourishing me and giving me as much energy as I put out or even more, then of course I don't want to be a hermit. I would enjoy it. I would be craving it every day. I think sometimes it's a reaction of you give a lot and some come back, but not sometimes that much. And then you're like, you know what? I think I'm done putting that much energy out because I need to kind of keep it to myself for a bit.
Yeah.
But again, that's not a sign that things are working great.
Yeah, no, pouring from an empty cup, so to speak.
Yeah.
How do you, are you a person that finds you recharge in silence and by yourself and kind of solitude, or you're someone that needs to be out and kind of start absorbing some energy?
No, I tend to be pretty much a homebody. I like to have my space. I like to have my quiet. I do like to do so. Like I do find that things like going to Jiu Jitsu is super healthy for me. So you do some of that, but I also need my space.
Do you have any type of like meditation or journaling practices that you kind of?
You know, one thing that I was thinking about it a lot last night, and I was like, I need to make this a more formal thing. I like the idea as a personal ritual. I like the idea of taking 5 minutes a day to sit down and think about who you want to be. You know, who are your heroes? Who are your role models? What's that scene in that movie that you really like because it inspires you about, wow, that's a fantastic way to live, or it's a fantastic way to behave and be a human being. I think like making almost a list of either great music or great lines from a book or great whatever, or even real life experiences, things that you can go back to and go like, you know what, I've always wanted to manifest this, be that person. Why am I falling short of that? How about today I don't? How about today I try to embody that as much as humanly possible? I think that's a healthy thing, because I don't think anybody's born thinking, I want to just become an asshole and be grumpy and respond poorly to, everybody. When you're a kid, you watch the movies, you want to be the hero because the hero is brave, he's generous, he's caring, has kindness, he's also tough, he's also has all this thing, and you're like, wow, I want to be just like that. Clearly, at some point, the overwhelming majority of people lose sight of that, and they do become something else that's extremely far from those qualities that they wanted to embody. So it's not that you didn't respond to the qualities, it's that you kind of lost the address of how to get there. So I think figuring out a way to make it almost a daily practice, so that when you find yourself reacting to something, it's so fresh in your mind who you want to be, and the contrast is so sharp that you'll immediately go, oh, wait, that's not quite the one I want to be, the one who, oh, your kid has spilled milk and so you yelled at them. It's like, come on, man. How about we don't do that? How about you don't react like an asshole over a little thing? How about you figure out a way that the person that you can be, that you have been in the best moment of your life, how can you be that person as much of every moment of the day as humanly possible?
Yeah. So where do you think people lose that kind of part of them? Because I agree with you wholeheartedly, and especially having young children, I see the purity of their essence, and being, and so many times that lashing out over spilt milk isn't about the spilt milk, right? It's all this other shit that's been built up, and that's the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, and you're just lashing out in this moment. And if you are able to step back and say, does the best version of me respond this or react this way? Does he respond this way? What would the highest version of me do in this particular situation? And you could have that moment in time where it almost, stands still, and you can make a conscientious, mindful decision based off of a trigger. Then you are stepping more into that space. But so much, especially now with social media, it's fake it till you make it. It's not this embodiment element, which I think is more healthy approach to it. It's just put on the song and the dance, slap it up on Instagram or whatever it is, and that's the version of you. Where do you think people lose that?
I think it's easy to become reactive, to have shitty things happen around you, shitty things are said or done around you, and so you react to that, and you're sure in the process of just being reactive to somebody else's stimuli, you end up playing their game. You end up, the best response to a shitty stimulus is still often not a great scenario. Figuring out how to ignore certain things or reframe them in a way where you don't get baited to play that particular game, I think is important, because I think what you describe is a lot of what we experience that make us less of what we want to be is a result of frustration, a result of getting caught in something that we are not comfortable with, getting somebody pushes your button and you react without really thinking because it's a delicate button and you haven't figured out how to deal with it. Some of it is inevitable, of course we're going to screw up, but I think the more mindful you can be of what your buttons are, and really that question of like, is this who I want to be? And sometimes it's the wrong thing to do and you do it anyway. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's like, what? I shouldn't get into this discussion on Facebook with so-and-so. And I should be kind and but I'm just going to let them have it because I'm frustrated. But at least if it's a choice, if you're doing it, okay, well, then we are in a better place because if you do that all the time, well, you got a problem. But if you choose once in a while to kind of blow off steam, maybe it's healthy, maybe it's okay. Nobody expects you to be a saint 24/7. Shit happens, okay. But I think like it's making it a conscious process rather than just somebody's nice to you, so you're smiley. Somebody's an asshole to you, so you're edgy and angry. Like not being constantly reactive to the stimuli that other people feed you, I think is important. Because otherwise you're kind of like the bull in the bullfighting ring, right? They wave the red in front of you and you charge. And it's like, there's no agency there. All you know how to do is to react to what other people are doing.
Right. And a lot of people are going to, play in the mud and try to draw you into the mud to play with them. That's how they get identified, and that's how they get themselves, validated through the experience. So they're going to kind of push your buttons because they're coming with their own baggage to the table, and they're coming with their own story and narrative to the table. And if you could recognize that, they are coming with their own shit, and not to own their shit, not to take their shit personally. But that also takes a radical amount of self-awareness that I think culturally we don't preach, we don't teach that to young children, and we end up growing up, so to speak, but we're still these gigantic children, and we don't know how to handle our emotions. We don't know how to interface with our actual feelings. So we do just lash out, and we just fall into kind of fall suit to what we've culturally become acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of it's not easy to overcome your reactive instinct. It's not easy it takes work. And sometimes you feel like, why can't you be nice? So I wouldn't have to do all this work to try not to react to your shitty vibes and figure out a way to. And so sometimes you do build resentment, you do get frustrated, you do get that sense. So I think that's it's a practice, it's a practice that's a life practice that you do all the time. Now, especially, I understand if it's some random asshole on social media, okay, maybe that's different, but especially when it comes to your loved ones, your friends, the people close to you, well, at least there, you want to have the ability to keep yourself in check and not react and snap and pass them your own frustrations to them. Because ultimately, that to me, what the hero is, right? The hero is somebody who has taken a lot of shit that life dishes out and figure out a way to make the bucket stop with them, where they don't pass all the frustration and ugly feelings that life has thrown at them and pass them to the next person, which is the classic abusing cycle of people who's abused who then abuse the next one, who's then traumatized who abuse the next one. And that's like half of human history right there, right? Traumatized people abusing other traumatized people and keeping the cycle going. I think like the true hero behavior is the one that has received a bunch of shit and figure out a way to say, no, this person didn't do it to me. This person doesn't deserve it. I'm not passing it on to them. I should deal with my own shit. I should deal with my own emotion. I should deal with my own stuff. I shouldn't just be carrying this hate that you need to dump onto somebody else. That's, I don't, and I use the word hero not lightly. I mean literally, like that takes tremendous guts, tremendous abilities. Hats off to anybody who's able to do that, because it's not an easy thing.
Yeah. That being said, out of history, who's someone that stands out to you as a true, by that definition, who stands out to you as a hero?
I think that's the problem. Like when you look at history, so often the history that makes it into the books is a history of psychos competing for power, which is not the history of, if you are a mom who hasn't slept for the past 6 months because their baby is keeping her awake and she's dealing with 10,000 other shit, and yet you find a way to not whack your kid in the head because they are being rowdy, but you find a way to talk to them gently but firmly, helping them understand boundaries, but at the same time, that to me is like, that's a hero, right? Does it end up in a history book? No. But that's more heroic than Alexander the Great conquering half of the world. You know what I mean? That's like some psycho ego driven bullshit. Whereas that's truly heroic. However, one ends up making the history book, one doesn't. So I think a lot of heroic stuff is found in daily gestures that will never end up on the pages of history.
We also have gotten away culturally from elders, right? And leaning into people that kind of can guide us and steer us away from, to some degree, the potholes that are on the road ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
How important have elders been in history, and what can we do to kind of lean back into that? Because, you go back to whether it be shamanic tribes or you go into any of these older cultures where the elders of the tribe are held at such a high standard. And especially in this country, it just seems like we just brush them to the side, put them in a nursing home, and we'll see you later. We've lost this homage to the elder. Where can people kind of pull that from, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's because there's no community. So if there's no community, the elder is who? Is somebody who just happened to be older than you, but just spend their life. It's like if you're part of a community and you know people day in and day out, you know their value, you know their worth, so maybe now they are 80 and they don't run around the way they used to, but they have been damn smart and being kind and having given good advice when they were 30, 40, 50, 60. So you don't stop listening to them when they are 80. Now, when they are 80, you find a place to work with it. But in the typical, look at the typical American system where it's like kids are out at 18, off they go. The interaction that they have with their parents, let alone a community, even their parents, is so limited. It's kind of like, okay, I'll see you for Thanksgiving, I'll see you for Christmas, I'll call you twice a month kind of thing. It's like, that's the opposite of tribe, right? There's not even parents and kids often are strangers to each other. When you look at how much quality time parents spend with their kids or adult kids spend with their parents, is so minimal that they are pretty much strangers to one another. So of course, when these people get old and they need more help, I guess you have an emotional attachment because they are your parents, but not really, because you never had that relationship to begin with. So it's, I think it goes hand in hand with the rebuilding of communities, of real face-to-face community where somebody you have known your whole life, there's a relationship there. You cannot just say, oh, respect your elders when your elders are just essentially strangers, because it's a different mechanic.
Yeah, that was one part of the monk who sold this Ferrari that kind of stood out to me, is when the couple brings in the elder mother and she starts dropping the food at the table and they get frustrated and they put her on a table on her own, and then he sees his daughter playing. He's like, oh, what are you doing? She's like, oh, I'm building a table for you when you get older. And it like shook him out of the system. He's like, oh, brought him back to the table. But yeah, and I also think that it goes back to kind of what we spoke a little bit earlier about the system that's in place that doesn't really allow people to have that time, that quality time. It becomes more of a novelty than the norm. And when we're stuck in a system that's like Go wake up, go to work, blah, 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 and you're stuck and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and a machine in its own right that it becomes very difficult to break free of that. And, thinking and having self-awareness and taking the time to reflect on yourself almost becomes a luxury.
Sure. Sure. And I think that's the problem, that we're asking to make these dramatic changes that are not only individuals, unfortunately. So you can be a smart, brilliant, talented individual and still you can fix some of these problems because they are so much. How do you start creating a village that's not like some crazy cult in the middle of the woods with your 30 friends, but is a healthy thing? How much money do you need to make that happen, to create that setup? How much? It's good luck. Some of these things are individual, right? Some of these things are about how you behave in day-to-day life, how you treat other people, how you choose to respond. Others are not individual, are so much larger than what any one person can do. And they are structural, and you almost need to make them something that that many other people are involved and putting resources, time, and energy, and you have a common. It's not an easy thing to do. Once a society loses those things, bringing them back, not an easy thing to do, because everything in that society is designed in another way. And specifically, the way our society is designed to is making money and buying things. That's kind of what it's designed for. That's the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 priority. That is what our lives are built on. So even if you don't share that idea, even if you think that it would be healthier to live a different way, you are still plunged into the system where everything around you is designed in that direction.
Yeah. And then it goes to your point where even if you did develop that ideal community, right, that nirvana place, right, you'd still have to have a system in place. And then that system potentially and ultimately would then become manipulated. And then you'd be back exactly where you are and what you tried to leave.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky, right? It's not an easy path.
No, and unfortunately, I think that so much of history, as much as we could see the writing on the wall, it's almost as if we are towards this trajectory that's inevitable. And as much as we may try to step on the brakes, it's it's a oil rig. It's a slow turn, and it does start with yourself, though, right? It does start with the individual, and it goes to your point earlier. If you're not filling your cup, it becomes that much harder to kind of spill out into others, and it becomes that much more exhausting and taxing on the individual, and it becomes harder to change the culture.
Yeah, because nobody goes out and just change the culture, right? You need to be able to change your immediate surroundings, your relationship, the things. And not that there's anything. If you could just snap your fingers and change the culture, do it. Great. The problem is it doesn't work that way. Takes monstrous amount of time and energy to make a zero point 0.1 change. Clearly, that same time and energy in the personal, in your immediate surroundings, have a much bigger impact, at least on some level. So figuring out how to balance it, like on one end, you want to put a lot in your immediate surrounding because that's where you have the most power to affect change. On the other hand, you don't want to forget that there's more than the tiny little happy island you created for yourself, and try to have a ripple effect impact that affect more is important, because ultimately your happy little island is going to get crushed eventually if forces around you are going in an ugly direction.
Yeah, it's operating on the micro, realizing it affects the macro, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're Elon Musk, who says that he'll donate the money to, and then even in that gesture of saying, yeah, I'll donate the money to solve world hunger, but figure it out first. He still gets shit for it no matter what. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Mm-hmm. Even because it's like, okay, you solve world hunger, you're a hero, fantastic. What do you do if everybody on Earth keep having 5 kids?
Right.
Well, now world hunger is renewed 3 seconds later, and then again, and then again. And so it's like, okay, we solved a problem, but we created another. So time out. How do we address that? Sometimes there are no easy solutions. Sometimes it's such a delicate balancing act that is like, forget that solving one problem is super hard, but then one problem is tied to 15 others. That's even more complicated.
Right.
That doesn't mean you should just throw up your hands and say, forget it all, because ultimately you're still alive. So unless, like, why else be alive unless you want to make a positive impact on those around you in the micro and on a larger scale in the macro?
Yeah.
But understand that you are definitely playing with large, complicated forces.
Yeah. And so many people lean into having one particular individual, whether it be a president or a religious, idyllic, whatever the word is,
Yeah.
figure step into play that they think is going to come and save them from all of this. And again, it goes back to the point of, it's really about operating in your own microsystem and working on yourself and allowing that to hopefully affect those around you.
And I think that's where you see the political divide and things like that. Where does it come from? It comes from the fact that people usually comes from rock and a hard place kind of scenario where there are no good answers, where good luck finding solutions to those problems, and you don't have anybody who has a real good solution. So you start arguing about which one is the less shitty solution.
Which is a terrible way to live.
It's a terrible way to live. And ultimately it's like, look, if you're asking me to pick between a whole variety of things, none of which are solving the problem.
Right.
We are all dealing with, like, somebody's making it 10 times worse, sometimes he's making it 5 times worse, somebody's keeping it even, not making it positive.
Right.
Fantastic. I can not see that the guy who is doing absolutely nothing is so much better than, and those discussions get ugly, because it would be easy if there was a clear-cut good answer, right? You would be like, look, this is objectively provable that this works, and your shit doesn't. Let's work with me here. But most of the time, it's not like that. It's not that one group has all these fantastic answers. It's one group has less shitty answers that do less damage, that are not really course correcting the trajectory. They are just getting there less fast and less in an ugly way. And those discussions are a problem, because then it's like...
Yeah, and then the problem is that it's like one thing from this side is like, oh, this is less shitty, and then one thing from this side is like, oh, well, that's less shitty. And instead of just making a pie chart and allowing them to overlap and go, okay, these are all the less shittier things, we argue over those things, rather than saying like, all right, this is a net good for everybody. Let's just bring this all together and create kind of a harmonious pie chart and overlap the things that we all could agree on. Like you said, the global state of the world. It needs to be, if we have no planet to live on, what's the fucking difference? None of it means anything.
Yeah. Big time.
Yeah, I know you're pressed for time, so I do appreciate it so much. Where can people connect with you? Where can people get the podcast? Where can people read all your work?
Sure. I think if you manage the complicated task of spelling my name correctly and Googling it, a lot of stuff will pop up. So I have 2 podcasts. Drunk and Taoist is free everywhere. History on Fire has a lot of all that, like I think 50 episodes or so are free. Others are just behind the paywall on Luminary. So probably check out all the free stuff and see if you're still interested or not, and then you can check out Luminary. I do use most social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, that kind of stuff. Books are out there. Good old Monopoly. Take care of them. And that's what's up.
Well, I'm a big fan of your work, and please keep it coming, because again, I think what you're bringing to the table is this revisitation of history, and you're adding this spin to it that is just common word, and just the mindset behind it. It's like you're in a really cool professor's class and you're getting all this amazing information, and you don't feel like you're sitting through history. You don't feel like you're having this lesson on life. You feel like you're just involved in this really cool experience. So I really appreciate your work, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. This is great.
Thank you.